Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We are going to be talking about one of the most important problems that the world faces, climate change. And it is such an important problem, and yet there is also hope that it might generate international cooperation. The United States historically has been the largest emitter. Today, China is the largest emitter. And even amidst all of the tensions, a trade war, conflict over territorial expansion by Russia, worries about conflict in the Taiwan Straits issues, amidst all these rising tensions between the United States and China, both sides have spoken of the hope that on climate change, they might be able to cooperate. And we also know that climate change is a policy area where Japan has historically exercised leadership, from hosting the Kyoto meetings that launched an important stage in negotiations and continuing to be ambitious in its own targeting. Japan's commitment under the UN Climate Change Convention is to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions by 26% from the 2013 levels by 2030. And Japanese prime ministers have continued to reinforce this with Prime Minister Kishida in his address to the UN General Assembly last month, strongly endorsing that Japan was going to fight for climate change with its leadership. So we're really excited today to have with us two leading experts to discuss this topic of China, Japan in global climate politics of climate change. We're going to first hear from Kelly Sims Gallagher, who joins us from up the street. She is the academic dean and professor of energy environment policy at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. Kelly Gallagher also serves as the director of the Climate Policy Lab, co-director of the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy. She has been a leading policymaker who served in the Obama administration as a senior policy advisor to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She is an accomplished scholar who has written extensively on these topics. One of her recent books has a wonderful title, and you can hold it up for us, Titans of the Climate, Explaining the Policy Process in the United States and China, recently published from MIT Press in 2019. She also has other books from MIT Press, which is one of the best publishers for environmental policy topics. Globalization of Clean Energy Technology, Lessons from China in 2014, and earlier, a book focused on China's auto industry. China Shifts Gears, Automakers, Oil, Pollution, and Development. I look forward to hearing her remarks. And following Dean Gallagher's comments, we will hear from Miranda Schreurs. Miranda Schreurs is the professor of environment and climate policy at the School of Government, Bavarian School of Public Policy at the Technical University of Munich. She is joining us today remotely from Germany. So we're very happy to have a hybrid seminar where we can cross the Atlantic to bring in the expert that we want to hear from. And Dr. Schreurs has done extensive work on environmental politics, looking at climate policies of the EU, United States, and China in comparison. She's examined the policies of Japan and Germany in comparison and has several accomplished books looking at these topics. She's the co-author of Nuclear Waste Governance and International Comparison, and the author of Environmental Politics in Japan, Germany, and the United States at a Cambridge University Press. I'd like to announce this seminar is co-sponsored as part of the special series on policy innovation in crises, supported by a grant from Japan Foundation. And Harvard has co-sponsors from the University Center of the Environment and the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. Before we enter into our talk today, I'd like to remind you that we will have a seminar next week on the theme of immigration, looking at refugees and the race in Japan, a turning point, with Nick Fraser and Michael Sharp. Let me remind you of our Zoom etiquette. Please keep your microphone silenced, and during the Q&A period, we will take questions from those who are joining us in the room here, as well as from those joining us online. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dean Gallagher.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if we could turn that. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. It's been a long time since I've been over for this seminar. And Miranda, great to see you remotely. Well, as you can tell from the introduction to me, I know much more about China than I know about Japan. So I'm going to focus most of my remarks today on China, but make a few observations about how Japan has engaged in the international climate negotiations, which I have observed. I think, as we think about China and Japan and the global politics of climate change, we should always begin with the domestic politics, because we know that foreign policy often arises out of domestic politics. So when I think about the domestic politics of climate in China, I refer immediately to this book that I co-authored with a colleague of mine in China, Xuan who is at the Development Research Center of the State Council. And the idea that he and I had for this book was to try to compare policy process in the two countries in a very systematic way. And of course, part of what influences the policy process in each country is our domestic politics. And really, this was the area that could not be more different between the United States and China. The domestic politics of climate change. Of course, in China, we have, as we've seen over the weekend, a very firmly entrenched single dominant party. Of course, there are other parties in China besides the Communist Party, but one single dominant party that luckily or fortunately from a climate change point of view believes in the science of climate change. Wholeheartedly accepts that climate change is a threat to China, in a way is a threat to China's national security. I think certainly believes it's a threat to China's national interests. And as I've sort of observed this over time, one reason why I think that the Communist Party has accepted climate change as an important challenge is because many of the party cadres were trained as scientists and engineers. So they don't really, have this instinctive, almost legalistic, if we think about it from a US point of view, reaction to argue everything. So there's been, a strong acceptance. The particular climate change impacts that I think the Chinese worry about the most are freshwater supply, because of course China relies heavily on the Tibetan Plateau as the source of most of its freshwater supply in the north, which is already an arid, water challenged region of China. And it's become even more so. I mean, as many of you know, the Yellow River no longer reaches the sea anymore. And yet northern China is an important agricultural area, particularly for wheat production. I think secondly, sea level rise. Earlier in the sort of development of Chinese climate policy, I think there was great concern about sea level rise in the Pearl River Delta region in particular. And then more recently, extreme flooding events and extreme heat events have really become obvious challenges. As I think many of you know, China experienced a record heat wave this past summer, largely around Sichuan. And, as we saw in other places also around the world, the heat wave was so severe that it caused a lot of evaporation of lakes and rivers which in turn rapidly diminished China's ability to provide adequate supplies of electricity. And in this region in particular, where a lot of hydropower is used, there was a 50% reduction in hydropower capacity. And that, is kind of leads to this vicious cycle where you can't run air conditioning because you don't have enough electricity. But China, for millennia has always been concerned about flooding events. If we think of in Chinese culture about the mandate of heaven and the importance of trying to prevent extreme weather events, this is very important. This is why the emperors used to go pray at the temple of heaven. And of course, we are seeing more extreme flooding events as well in China. So I think all of these are threats that the party has taken seriously, but also the party sees a lot of opportunity in climate mitigation. And this was the big observation I made in the earlier book, The Globalization of Clean Energy. And I was doing the research for that book in 2010. And at that time, I was doing case studies of clean energy industries, nascent at the time, clean energy industries, solar PV, batteries, electric vehicles, coal gasification, gas turbines. And it became obvious to me that China was making a big bet that most people outside of China had not yet realized on these clean energy industries, and that China saw these industries as industries of the future. In fact, that was embodied in industrial policy and in China's financing policy, which industries it was supporting for development. And they were using an export-led development model, their classic export-led development model, intending to export these technologies to the rest of the world, where markets were being formed, in particular in Germany, to make a connection with Miranda. Germany's renewable energy law had created a big market with its feed-in tariff that China wanted to serve in the United States. While we didn't have a good federal level policy, although we did have these production tax credits that stopped and start at the state level, like in California and Massachusetts and New York, there were policies that were creating incentives. So I think the Chinese initially intended to look externally to sell these technologies, and then later realized that, especially after the cost of these technologies had come down, that there was a lot of domestic benefit for China. Today, I think energy security has kind of come back to the fore and is a very high priority for the party. Han Zheng, the senior vice premier, recently stated, and this is a quote, that energy security is the most important task for the government. And what's helpful from a climate point of view is that renewable energy deployment serves both goals, right? It serves China's domestic energy security goal, and it serves the climate change goal. But coal, which is, China's other big domestic energy endowment, has the opposite effect. Increased expansion of coal in the Chinese in China will, of course, not be a good thing from a climate change point of view. And we have seen China restarting some of its plans to build out coal due to energy security concerns. But not as much as one might have thought. And a report just came out today, actually, that showed that Chinese emissions have actually dropped 8% so far this year, which may be a reflection of potential emerging recession in China, but it also, I think, also accurately reflects the continued very rapid expansion of new capacity in renewable energy in China. So getting back to some of the politics, I think China has the same challenge that probably every other country has in the socioeconomic transitions related to climate change. And I don't think that China has really confronted those socioeconomic transitions yet. It has, I think, the largest number, but India's might be higher, of coal miners in the world. The latest estimate is 2.6 million coal miners who would need to find other jobs if China manages to drastically reduce its coal consumption. They're regionally concentrated in the Northeast. So those provinces are going to be resistors to the low carbon transition. And it's not just coal, it's all the heavy industry in China that is a major energy consumer. Of course, China is in the midst of a very rapid compositional change in its economy as it has made this tremendous effort to shift to services and lighter manufacturing. But still, there's a huge amount of iron and steel, cement, et cetera, production. And there's a lot of workers associated with those industries who need to find other jobs. And I would furthermore point out that all of these traditional industries are largely state-owned enterprise industries. They're not the private industry. The clean energy industries are much more likely to be private companies or perhaps locally state-owned companies. So we have an interesting political challenge that the state-owned enterprises are the ones that need to go away or find, transformative ways to produce their products in ways that don't cause climate change. Okay, let me shift to China's global politics and foreign policy. It has taken the UN Framework Convention seriously. It had every excuse to withdraw from the Paris Agreement after the United States withdrew under the Trump administration, but it didn't. It stayed the course. And I think that was notable, especially in light of the fact that the US and China had stood up together in the run-up to Paris and jointly announced their targets implicitly, really almost explicitly, committing to each other that we would both implement these commitments. I think it is struggling today to play a leadership role in the negotiations. A principal challenge is that China continues to like to sort of hide behind the G77 in terms of its differentiated commitments on climate finance. But as we look to the upcoming negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, the number one issue on the agenda is climate finance. And what is China willing to do on climate finance? When Xi Jinping announced at the UN General Assembly that China would stop funding overseas coal, he committed in the next breath to stepping up support for clean and renewable energy overseas. But there's been no evidence of that yet. And I think increasingly LDC countries will be demanding more support from China for low carbon development finance and also resilient. It's really not clear whether China is on track to peak, which is its 2030 commitment to peak its emissions. The ambiguity about the role of coal, is raising questions. However, I do think it's on track to achieve its non-fossil energy commitment and its carbon intensity commitment. And most likely its peaking commitment. Big questions about what will be its next commitment beyond 2030. And mixed signals on that so far. So now let me just turn to some differences that I observed between China and Japan. Of course, the domestic energy endowment picture is completely different. China has an enormous land area which is very well disposed for deployment of renewable energy. Renewables take up a lot of land, and this is something that is very constrained in the Japanese context. And China also has a lot of domestic coal, which likewise Japan does not have. So I think these two obvious differences explain a lot about how these two countries have approached this challenge differently. My observation is that Japan is trying to step up its role in climate finance. It recently doubled its contribution to the Adaptation Fund, which is a very important dedicated fund in the context of the Climate Convention to support developing countries with adaptation. That sort of matches well with Japan's interest and commitment to disaster risk reduction. As I'm sure many of you know, Japan hosted the convention that led to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction in 2015. That's not particularly climate focused, but these are all aligned. You know, helping to reduce countries' risks to major disasters, helping to make countries more resilient to disaster. This is a emerging niche for Japan in terms of how it's approaching its role internationally. I would say it's been pretty marginalized in its contribution to the international negotiations since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. In part because Japan has been so challenged with its own domestic commitment in the wake of Fukushima. Yes, Japan has made a commitment to net zero. Yes, it has committed to this 46% reduction below 2013, which was the year it peaked. And it just issued this new basic energy plan. But I think Japan has not, felt confident about its ability to play a leading role in the global climate negotiations because it hasn't sorted out how Japan is going to get to net zero. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn the floor over to Miranda and look forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Shall I jump right in here?
Yes, please go ahead, Miranda.
Okay, then I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can all see this. And let me just make sure. Okay, so somehow I'm not on the first page here. Let me go back. I don't know why that happened, but that's always the problem when you're
It's a beautiful image.
yeah, okay, now we're on the first page. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about Japan's climate and energy policies. And I put in the word politics as well. Interestingly, in German, we don't make a difference between the words policies and politics, and yet, in fact, they're very important differences. So I am going to take you back just for a moment in time, because I want to talk to you a little bit about Japan and energy and how that plays a little bit into what is going on with narratives around energy security and narratives around what kinds of economic developments Japan might see, as well as its foreign relations. And one of the very first defining times for Japan was the 1973-74 oil shock, which is the first time that Japan actually started to look into renewables. And you see a list here of energy forms that are things we're talking about still very much today: solar, geothermal, hydrogen, coal gas liquefaction, not so much, but these are basically not new ideas. They've been around, and interestingly, Japan was one of the world's leaders back in the 1970s on renewable energy. Of course, a much earlier set of technologies and programs, But the oil shock hit Japan very hard, and it really led to some important changes in energy policies and programs. Energy saving also became an important part of politics in the 1970s. And of course, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, the whole question of Japan needing to develop a nuclear energy industry. Jumping a little bit in time, already back in 1990, Japan committed to a voluntary climate target. But as we just heard, Japan was actually quite on board with climate activities internationally. It stayed with the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997, although the United States ended up not ratifying the agreement. And although later on Canada pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, so Japan basically allied itself with the European Union at this time, committing to a reduction on CO2 emissions and basically seeing climate as an area where Japan had a role to play. So I think this is something that's worth thinking about, as is Japan's role industrially. One of the things that Japan developed already, drawing out of its 1970s experiences, was what they call the Top Runner program, which basically gives industries incentives to move upward in their performance and in their standards, whichever product producer is producing the most energy efficient model of something, whether it's a refrigerator or a laptop or a lamp or an air conditioner, that standard quickly becomes the standard for the rest of the industry. So it's something that has helped Japan in terms of its international competitiveness. And Japan also introduced some really kind of cool models and campaigns in the late 1990s into the early 2000s. We started to see a search for ways that Japan could innovate. And one of the innovations that emerged were the combination of the cool biz and the warm biz campaigns. As we all know, the traditional men's black suit was quite common, not only in Japan, but throughout Asia. And one of the things that Yoriko Koike introduced, and it was picked up by Prime Minister Koizumi, is the idea that Japan can save energy by changing the way people dress. And this is a campaign that continues to this day. It's also taken off and been picked up by some other countries. So if we look at Japan internationally and we think about, well, have any of these campaigns in the past really led to much in the way of change? In some ways, you could say yes. Japan's CO2 per capita emissions, you can see they go up and down a little bit, but they range somewhere between, let's say, 8.5 and 9 tons. There was a high point just after the Fukushima crisis when they peaked a little closer to 10 tons of metric tons per capita. That's about what Germany is doing with its per capita CO2 emissions. It's higher than France. It's actually getting close. China's getting close to this level as well. But of course, it's much higher than India, which is still at about 1.7 tons per person. So something we should also think about in the background in terms of thinking about how's Japan performing is the reality that Japan's population is starting to decline. It had a peak in 2009 at 128 million, and that remained for a couple of years. But the slow decline has begun. And of course, you never know, but estimates are that by 2050, probably Japan's population is going to be somewhere around 20 to 25 million people less than it was back in 2009. So Japan is moving towards a population of 100 million, unless we just heard that next week there's going to be a discussion on immigration, unless something changes with Japan's immigration policies. But this matters, of course, for economic activities, domestic activities, and the CO2 emissions that come with different population sizes. I just pulled out one example here of the very many policies that Japan has introduced in the past. So Japan not only was member of the Kyoto Protocol back in 2009, Japan started to set out pledges, for example, to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 25% in 1990 levels by 2020. Of course, one of the big challenges is that in between we had the Fukushima nuclear crisis, which we'll get to in a minute. If we look at Japan's electricity supply, just before Fukushima, it looked like this. Japan was very heavily relying on thermal sources, so that's oil and coal, for its electricity, but also take a look at the share here of nuclear. It was about 32% of the electricity supply. And of course, with the Fukushima nuclear accident, things changed. In 2010, Japan had 54 operable nuclear power plants, 53 actually in operation. You see them here on this map. They were across the country. You'll notice relatively little in Hokkaido, a lot along the coasts of Japan. Well, with the Fukushima nuclear crisis, politics around energy once again changed. So first we had that oil crisis back in the 1970s, and here in the early 2010s and 2011, the nuclear crisis begins. So what's happened is that for a short time after the Fukushima crisis, all of the nuclear power plants were shut down for maintenance checks and security checks to make sure that they could operate under new standards that were established, safety standards that were established. So for many years, basically from 2012 until, I guess about 2015, there were no operating nuclear power plants. But slowly they've started to be turned on again. And so there are now 9 plants that are okayed for operation. As we recently heard, that looks like there will be plans for more in the near future. Now, looking at this from a German perspective, this might be a little bit different than the perspective that we have in the United States or in Japan. But here in Europe, we're looking very nervously at what's happening in the border areas because of the war in the Ukraine. And the fact that here we have the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant being attacked, this is something that makes many Europeans quite nervous, also about the potential for some kind of further nuclear accident. Japan, too, has been watching what's going on in the Ukraine. Japan has joined the sanctions against Russia. It has now brought its crude oil and its coal imports substantially down. It's no longer importing crude oil, and it's cut back on coal supply. But interestingly, it is continuing to import natural gas, liquid natural gas from Russia. So Japan's allied with Europe and the United States against Russia, but its imports from Russia have actually increased in revenue terms because of the high price of gas. It's still importing about 9% of its liquid natural gas from Russia. And just as a little footnote, Japan is the world's largest importer of liquid natural gas. So what does all of this mean in terms of Japan's climate situation? Well, this graph, yes, it's written in Japanese here, but it shows you the greenhouse gas emissions of Japan from 1990 until 2019 during the pandemic. And what you see are a couple of things here: rising CO2 emissions that then were starting to decline a little bit. And then we have the Fukushima nuclear accident. And of course, they go way back up in 2013 because increased coal use and the shutdown of all those nuclear power plants, the CO2 emissions started to increase drastically. In the meantime, emissions are starting to drop again, but the challenge for Japan is still large. And we can see by sectors, here we have the industrial sector. We've seen some decline in the industrial sector. Of course, part of that is also decline of production. And in other areas, also a challenge that we see here in Europe, the transport sector. It's declined a bit more in Japan than it has in than in Europe. But it's a sector that hasn't really seen a whole lot of improvements in terms of its CO2 levels. So Japan is struggling with how to make progress here on these emissions. And the Climate Action Tracker, which is one of the many NGOs that is out there observing the actions of countries, is pretty critical on their assessment of Japan, that while Japan has a domestic target that is moving the world a little bit under a 2°C target, it sees that the policies and actions in place are insufficient for getting the country there. And they see climate finance as critically insufficient, although that might not take into account the more recent announcements of Japan to increase its funding in terms of third world development. And it's quite interesting when you look at their critique here, because you see where Japan has set a domestic target compared to what a 1.5-degree world would look like, or where their current policies and actions are relative to what needs to be done. So there's quite a lot of critique here, and I think this is playing in also to some of the most recent developments. So on August 24th of this year, Prime Minister Kishida announced plans to restore more of the idled nuclear power plants and to invest in next generation nuclear. The public is in a small majority still opposed to the restart of nuclear power plants, but this opposition is weakening. And I think a factor that's playing a role here are the hot summers that Japan has also been facing, and rising electricity prices. At the same time, however, we do see Japan doing quite a lot on renewables. So you'll see that the share of renewables in the electricity sector has pushed Japan up much beyond where it was in 2010. I think it was something around 3%, and now it's getting close to 20% of the electricity. But that's still a long ways to go. If you compare that in Germany, Germany is now at about 50%, and Germany is targeting 80% by 2030. So in comparison, Japan is quite falling behind, let's say, for a country of similar size to Germany. Nevertheless, we have seen some pretty dramatic changes. Japan is one of the larger countries in terms of solar PV capacity. So it's not as big as China, which of course is a much, much larger country, or the United States, but it's larger than India, and it has surpassed Germany. Excuse me. And we know that Germany for a long time was the world leader here. So that's quite impressive, some of the changes that have been going on. At the same time, we are starting to see public opposition to renewables, and they existed already to wind. Japan has not done a lot with development of wind, but a lot of the investment in Japan on renewables has been in the form of mega solar parks. There are an estimated 6,000 mega solar parks now in Japan. And this has led to a lot of concerns about destruction of nature and the living environment. So certainly policies play a role here in terms of what kind of renewable energy projects are permitted and which kinds of projects are given preferences. There's also a reality that renewable prices are much higher in Japan than they are in Germany or in Europe. And that too, of course, plays into attitudes and opinions about renewables. You nevertheless see that in Japan, there has been quite a growth in the solar capacity. It's the dark red color here. Although it's also quite interesting to see how much China has taken off here. China is now by far the world's largest solar PV in terms of capacity. Last year alone, China introduced more solar PV than we had in Germany across the entire history of German solar PV. So in 1 year, China's just been really taking over the field, let's say. And I just pulled out one other kind of example here, which is the geothermal power, which is an area where Japan, you would think, has quite a lot of potential considering the volcanic islands of Japan. But it's not an area where we've seen a whole lot of growth. And part of that seems to be because of concerns about the traditional use of the geothermal for leisure purposes, as well as the fact that many of the geothermal sites are in national parks. So Japan has announced a carbon neutral goal for 2050. It is a big leap for Japan. Japan was under considerable pressure to do this after country after country started to announce their climate neutral goals for around the mid part of the century. The fact that Japan is struggling with its emissions, you can see this in a form here. These are the trends from 1990 to 2019, and we don't really see a huge drop here. And this is expectations for where Japan is supposed to be in 2030 and here for 2050. So you can see that what needs to be done is a really, really big change. So that was basically what I wanted to share with you. And I see it's getting dark here. We're, whoopsie, going into nighttime. And so I'm eager to enter into discussion with everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The fascinating presentations by both of you. And I really appreciate your touching on the domestic politics, the industrial policies, and some areas for progress, as well as where we need to work more in the future. I'd like to open to questions, and our first question is going to be by one of the associates with the program on U.S.-Japan relations, Nobuhiro Mitsuoka, who works at NTT and has been doing ambitious research on how we could realize a carbon-free society.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very informative talk. I'm Nobu. I learned from Kelly's talk, the Chinese government decarbonizing policy and industries is definitely making progress. And so my question is, has there been any discussion on the material footprint, which measures the consumption of natural resource in China? Because in 2018, when I was in Beijing as a Japanese diplomat, the Chinese government came to visit us several times to visit the waste disposal and recycling method. A large amount of solar panels are still being disposed of and not recycled. Of course, not only China, but also Japan and other developed countries are facing similar problems. So I would very much appreciate your advice.
Okay, I don't know the answer to your question. I can say that, as you probably know, that the Chinese have become very committed to what they call a circular economy. And, but I don't think as of yet, they have achieved a circular, I mean, obviously, China has not achieved a circular economy. But I think that I would be optimistic that China would start to develop recycling plans for all of its clean energy industries, in part because global supply chains are increasingly getting constrained. And in fact, China's been experiencing a polysilicon shortage recently. So I think China will want to do as much as it can to ensure the security of supply of components for all of, whatever it is, whether it's lithium ion batteries or solar PV. But I'm not exactly sure what the current state of affairs is on the recycling of solar panels.
Miranda, would you like to join in on this question?
What I can say is 2 years ago, I was a member of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, and we were working exactly on the questions of how do we do green value chains, what kinds of policy advice can China gain from examples from other countries, and what are some of the ways to think about it. Recycling of solar panels is beginning as an industry, but it's really still an emerging industry, in part because there haven't been that many solar panels to recycle yet. It is something that will start to happen as soon as the lifetime of the solar panels has been reached. And in Europe, that's starting to happen. In China, they started later. But this is an industry that's emerging. India's also showing a lot of interest in this area.
Questions. So thank you very much for professors for inspiring presentations. So I'm also, my name is Morikawa from University of Tokyo. I'm an academic associate at the Training Center. So I'm also working on the environmental process of Japan actually now. And I have two questions to professors. So I'm really interested in Professor Gallagher's emphasis on the realistic aspect of Chinese policy making. That's quite interesting due to the presence of engineers in the policy making process. So my feeling is that such a policy discussion, especially environmental policy discussion in Japan, is somewhat less professionalized. So they have many opinions, but not led by the engineers or environmental professionals, etc. So maybe you may be talking about the top level policymakers, but I'm interested in how professionalize the Chinese policy making environmental related issues, and also in Germany. So I heard that I think more involvement in the scientists in the policy making. So how deep or how far the professional involvement in the policy making in two countries are made? So that's for my first question. And the second question is that we are also conducting some of the comparison between Japan and actually Germany. And we think that the important difference is the citizen involvement to the policy discussions. So how do you find the difference among these three countries, citizen involvement? So China, Japan, and Germany. So that's my second question. So professional involvement to the policy process and citizen involvement in the policy process.
Well, why don't I jump in first here, and then I'll turn the floor over to Kelly. Thanks for the question. One of the things that has been interesting for me to observe as an academic is how Germany has gone from a country in the early 1990s when you had you had very few environmental think tanks, to being a country that is extremely active with environmental think tanks and involvement. And you also have a policy process here that involves both academics and the populace, citizens, in decision-making circles, in advisory circles. So that's extremely common. And I understand that in the Japanese case, one of the big differences is that although ministries also have Shinjikai, they have Koenkai, they have advisory bodies, the plurality of the membership is much more restricted. And here, membership in committees is often tied to different political parties. So you have a whole spectrum of opinions that are included from the science community as well as from citizens in policy-making processes. And it's also now reaching the point that you have citizen groups that themselves are really very actively proposing policies. And in Japan, I think one of the big challenges is that the citizen groups are much more limited in their capacity. Here you have people who are professionally paid to be members of think tanks and NGOs. And in Japan, people struggle with that as their weekend activity or their nighttime activity, and there's no pay. So it's much harder, I think, for the citizens to be engaged. And you don't perhaps have as much plurality in the science debates that are going on in Japan within policy circles. I'll just say one or two words on China, but Kelly is really the deeper expert here on the China case. My impression is that in China, there is some room for citizen voice, more than is often assumed in the West. In the West, I think there's often a general assumption that China is the authoritarian state and the citizens have no voice. But clearly voice is much more limited, and it's much more restricted in terms of you don't have as many protests in China as you do either in Japan or Germany. You know, Germany much more than Japan, and Japan substantially more than China. So Kelly, I'll let you take on.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although I don't have a really good sense of how open citizen participation in the climate policy making process is today. You know, I haven't been to China now for 3 years, and so I really don't have any idea what it feels like when you're there. You know, even as of the last time I was there in 2019, I would say there was a limited role for NGOs and civil society in that they were permitted to do public education campaigns, to some extent, you know, gentle criticism, but it was not a very permissive space. And I think increasingly that space is even more constrained. And for international NGOs, there's much more supervision now, with this new system of having, you know, a government agency responsible for you. They call this the mother-in-law relationship, you know, and my understanding is that they, you know, the international NGOs really have, in a very detailed and granular way, have to talk about all of their plans, whatever it is, and have them all pre-approved before they can do anything. So that's a pretty narrow, you know, remit. And I think the international NGOs maybe have more freedom even than the domestic NGOs. But on the question of the role of scientists in the policy making process, I'm going to broaden that to be like a more inclusive term of experts, because I think it's not only natural and physical scientists who actually have a fairly limited role, but rather more social scientists, engineers, and policy experts who actually have a robust role in the policymaking process, especially at the central government level. So in fact, China has an experts committee on climate change, which is a very senior level committee. It's endured for many years now. In fact, I can't even remember when it was first established, but I think in the 1990s, the composition of the group has changed over time. But all of those experts are relied on heavily to provide advice on climate change policy. And the government regularly will commission studies from different universities and think tanks in China. And it has even established its own think tanks, like the National Climate Strategy Center, which used to be housed in the National Development Reform Commission, moved to MEE, and then I think has moved back again, or is in the process of moving back to NDRC. Most of the policy formulation is done by these universities and by these think tanks, and then proposed to the government and often adopted. And I think some of the experts, have the capability of directly briefing very senior members of the Chinese government and being quite influential at pivotal moments. For example, China's decision on its NDC, or China's decision to go for carbon neutrality. So I think it's important to distinguish between the central government, though, and subnational levels, because I don't think that there is the expertise in each province, in the universities or in different think tanks, to be able to provide that kind of advice. So some of the international NGOs have been trying to support that work at the provincial and sub-provincial level. For example, I'm on the board of Energy Foundation China, which funds a lot of work supporting provincial level governments or city level governments to do studies, and it helps identify experts to answer questions that the provincial level government has. So while the universities around, in Beijing, in particular Tsinghua, you have this really strong influence and strong capability and capacity to do climate policy research. I don't see that mirrored in a lot of universities around China.
Oh, thank you very much. Very interesting. So I think that's kind of grassroots, some of the involvement from researchers or citizens are very weak in Japan. So it's interesting to see the more activities in China. Yeah, thank you very much.
More reliance on science at the upper elite level. We have a remote audience question from Professor Ian Miller from the History Department. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question, Ian?
Sure. Thank you, Christina. And I just want to say hi, Miranda, and thank you, Miranda and Kelly, for really marvelous interventions. I was a little late, so forgive me if my question, which is already perhaps adjacent to rather than directly in line with the presentations, but please forgive me if it was already addressed. One of the major initiatives here at Harvard that the university is driving forward is solar geoengineering. And so geoengineering being the increase of the Earth's albedo through various technical interventions in the atmosphere and various Earth systems, trying to, in essence, it makes the Earth a little brighter. So we reflect more of the sun's energy back outward into space. The critiques of solar geoengineering in general are that it's business as usual approach to a more critical problem, that it's global in scale, but can be local in origin. And that, of course, it's a technical fix. And we all know that the history of technical fixes to really large problems, that is, things rarely turn out the ways we expect. But my question really is a factual one, and that is how and in what ways has either solar radiation modification or solar geoengineering or related approaches to the Earth system, how have they intersected with the dynamics that you've laid out for us so clearly and eloquently? Are they front and center in the discourses that you're looking at? Are they marginal? If they're not there at all, that's fascinating, because they are certainly moving rapidly to the center of discourse, especially at a technocratic level and through industry here in the US. So just really curious if you could speak to the solar geoengineering question and its place or non-place in the processes you've outlined. And thank you again, Christina, this is a great topic. Really grateful to you all for hosting such a marvelous presentation.
Thanks. Who wants to go first? Miranda?
I'll jump in again here. Thanks, Ian. Nice to see you. I think that you could say that in Japan, it's an area where there's a little bit of research being done, but it's not a big part of the policy discourse. And I imagine that part of that is, I think one reason, and you tell me if you think otherwise, but I think one reason that this is getting so much play in the United States is that it's also something that is much more closely involved with large-scale interventions such as military interventions, and that the military also plays a not insubstantial role in these kinds of geoengineering discussions. And I think in Japan, that's just, it doesn't play out in the same kind of scale. I have not heard about it in the Chinese case. So Kelly, I don't know if you have anything to add.
To my knowledge, there's no research and no interest in solar geoengineering in China or any form of geoengineering. But I think that might just be, because China has so wholeheartedly embraced the clean energy revolution and, is trying so hard to dominate global markets. I mean, I've called this green mercantilism. And so I think that's where most of the effort and intentionality is in China. But I would say China loves nothing more than a giant engineering project, so I could imagine China embracing this kind of approach, particularly if it starts to feel at risk. I've thought for a long time, while I support doing technical research on solar geoengineering, we really need to have some sort of system for global governance of these even research efforts, and no such system exists yet. I would anticipate that the Chinese would support some sort of global governance system. I think they would be worried about certain countries going rogue and affecting China, adversely affecting China. So I think this is a really important topic that has been neglected for too long.
Can I just jump here and say, I would challenge just in one way. I think where China really has jumped in on geoengineering is in a less engineering modus, but with its reforestation and afforestation initiatives. That's often claimed to be the largest geoengineering project in the world, where you also are affecting albedos with your darkening surfaces and that impacts solar radiation. But clearly, it's considered the geoengineering project that is least likely to have severe negative consequences, although a lot of people who work in the biodiversity field also challenge whether or not geoengineering of reforestation and afforestation pays enough attention to the diversity of the forests.
Reforestation was the one policy that even President Trump did support. That's true.
Thank you both. My only addition is that I think one thing along with the military aspects that sets the United States apart is the role of exceedingly wealthy individuals in fueling some of these research agendas. So in a world of billionaires, these technical fix approaches can be very attractive. And of course, that further underlines Kelly's very welcome point on governance and its necessity moving forward. Thank you. That's really helpful.
wanted to ask about the question of governance on two policy issues that are relevant. One is the sharing of research, because as this pioneering research has tremendous economic stakes for profits of important industries, but also great public good stakes for improving our environmental policies. There's the question of whether it's treated as a national security private research where we won't allow Chinese national scholars to participate in sharing of the research, versus we want to create an international collaboration where the best and the brightest from every country get together and any research as soon as it's discovered would be shared. How can we generate that kind of, is the IPCC, I always stumble on that. Is that working? Does it need adjustment? So that's one question. The second is on this green mercantilism, the trade climate nexus is so difficult. Like the United States has finally launched an initiative to support green energy research and industry. But the industrial side is a build national, and we already have Korea. Yesterday, the European Commission Vice President Dombrovskis was at Harvard Law School and spoke about how European subsidies are non-discriminatory and the new Biden administration subsidies are discriminatory, and this is a problem. So we clearly have, I'm sure, China frustrated as well, that the European investment in supporting green energy is going against free trade rules. And so how, you don't want to challenge that. You don't want to have Europe and China telling the US to stop subsidizing research and investment in green energy. So what is the path forward to get a public good environment for research and industrial subsidies on climate change? Small question.
Okay, I'll go first.
You're gonna go first
time,
because you're
right?
right next to me.
So I would say on the research side, it's very hard to imagine the US and China directly engaging in joint research projects today. But it wasn't so long ago that there was a robust program that was co-funded on each side. There were, I think, 5 or 6 sort of functional domains, and the two countries' scientists were actively working together, doing demonstration projects together. There was public and private participation in all of these projects, ranging from green buildings to carbon capture, utilization and storage to electric vehicles. I think I cannot imagine any new initiatives like that in the current political context. But both countries are members of, and I believe Japan is as well, though, off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure, of Mission Innovation, which was this initiative announced at Paris in 2015, where governments committed to double their research, development, and demonstration spending. And then there was a parallel set of commitments from private industry led by Bill Gates, and they created something called the Breakthrough Energy Coalition. And they, in turn, committed to, I can't remember, some large number of mobilization of large amounts of funding. That is actually still in operation, still functional. In fact, they just had their ministerial meeting in Pittsburgh last month, hosted by Secretary Granholm. And there are a lot of multilateral research initiatives going on through the Mission Innovation construct. So I think that more multilateral approach or mini multilateral approach is likely to be the only institutional form we're going to see. However, I think increasingly the US is becoming protectionist in its clean energy industries. Obviously, the imposition of tariffs on solar panels from China, which happened, from Germany as well. Was debatable, I guess. I strongly oppose them because I saw no evidence of dumping, just surplus capacity in China. But I think a lot of that arose from the sense that the US had lost almost complete control of the global markets. And in fact, on almost every clean energy technology, China far surpasses the United States in terms of its global market share. But interestingly, the one country that still surpasses China in some domains is Japan. So I think Japan has maintained a very dominant position, no matter how you measure it, what indicators you use, in terms of its comparative advantage on some of these low carbon technologies. And Korea also more volatile if you look at the data over time, but also pretty impressive record. So I'm kind of glad the US is getting back into the race, so to speak. And actually on Wednesday, I'll be speaking about this race in the Fairbanks Center series. So if you're interested in this topic, you can come and I'll be showing some of the data. But I do worry a lot about trade, particularly from the point of view of least developed countries and how they're going to access these technologies, how costly they're going to be. And can they also benefit in terms of their own economic development? Can they manufacture and compete in the global marketplace against such dominant players like Japan, China, and Korea? Is there any room left for a country like Egypt, to develop a, clean energy industry and be able to export? Or India might be a more plausible example. And we don't have a functional WTO, which is very worrying. And of course, Europe is committed to protecting its own carbon market. So maybe Miranda can talk about the CBAN and how that might influence.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I think we are indeed entering into a period of enhanced protectionism. If you look at the response of China to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and cutting off the China-U.S. Climate dialogues. If you look at the enhanced discussions that have also led to policy changes in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Bill, the infrastructure bill, a lot of that is about dealing with the problems in the United States, but a lot of it is also dealing with an industry that is falling behind. And how do you become enhanced in your competitiveness compared with other very powerful states, whether that's China or Japan or Korea or Europe. But also in Germany, it's partly a reaction to the Russian war on the Ukraine that is impacting European thinking about China as well. Europe became very heavily dependent on Russia for its fossil fuels, and people are now recognizing what that can mean, that you can use dependency as a political or a security weapon. And there's growing concern about European dependence on China for its markets. And I think that the same is true in Japan and Korea and in Taiwan, the incredible dependence on the Chinese marketplace. And so you're seeing growing discussion here about the need to move manufacturing back and to be producing more at home. And why is it that we need to be importing everything from China? So unfortunately, in many ways, we're starting to see a growing nationalism, which If you want to be pessimistic, it means that working together on really important, big global challenges like climate change could become harder. If you want to be optimistic, and I like to be optimistic, it could mean that we will see enhanced competition to be leaders in clean energy technologies and in circular economy technologies, and that this could in fact move things forward. So you can read the developments in different ways. I imagine it's going to be a bit of a mixture of the two. But it does mean that our climate negotiations in Egypt in a month's time are likely to be challenging. I don't think this is going to be a international negotiation where we see really big progress. And for a country like Japan, it also, Japan's not going to be the country that comes in and comes up with a really big new initiative here. So I think we're actually entering into challenging times. And it's hard to know how things are developing. I don't know if the sense of insecurity is as high in the US right now as it is in Europe. In Europe, there's really a lot of jittery feelings right now.
There is much to worry about, but fortunately we do have both of you as scholars and policy participants, so maybe you can give some sage advice and nudge your governments or the broader public in a better direction. Certainly we need more discussions such as this. I'm sorry to bring to a close, but we are at the end of our time and it's in the late evening. Miranda, thank you so much for joining us from Germany. And thank you very much, Kelly, for coming out. And for those who want to hear more, it sounds like next week you can hear more from Kelly at the Fairbanks Center event. And both are prolific writers, so we can also read their work. Thank you so very much, those who've joined us in the room and online. And thank you to Shin Fujihira and Sophie Welsh for helping to bring together a hybrid event that allowed us all to participate in different forms. This also helps us to reduce the carbon imprint by not having as much plane travel, which was on the agenda before the pandemic sent us to remote for other reasons. So thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you very much.